Hi, welcome to the Pursuit of Truth. So on the COVID inquiry, Sir Patrick Vallance is talking. Everyone remembers him from his the podium talks with Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock and Professor Chris Whitty. And he's talking about how science was used when it was used, and when they didn't want to hear it, they didn't get invited to meetings, and their evidence wasn't always used, and he's calling for the publishing of evidence, which makes sense. And the reason why he wants evidence published, is because if evidence published and then governments have a policy that's against it, we can all say, wait a minute, look at the evidence, why are you doing this? And I could see why the reluctance of governments to produce, this is the way it happens. I mean, it's not just government, this happens in lots of different places, in workplaces and everywhere. In businesses, anywhere where there's, because people want to keep things to themselves and often don't want to really do what's necessary. And like in this case where, this was life and death for so many people, you'd think that, there would be no problem. You've got these scientists who know about this and you don't know about it. You're just, someone who doesn't know about bacterial viruses or COVID or whatever, science of biology and what can happen to you and what needs to be done and the procedures and etc. And you've got these great people that know all this. Well, let's just ignore them and we'll do something that goes counter to that, like the eat at home, the eat outside policy that he goes on about, which Rishi Sunak, who was then the Chancellor, obviously wanted to do to increase economy, because that's what it was all about. It wasn't actually, and this follows on from the last Pursuit of Truth about the climate change. It doesn't matter about us. It doesn't matter about what's the right thing to do. What matters is money. What matters is that's money, because everyone needs money. Businesses need money. Governments need money. They need the money. Without the money, look at the situation. Because of people staying at home for 2 years, we're in this cost of living crisis because they borrowed so much to give us and this, that and the other. If we didn't have money, we wouldn't have this problem. We've got an artificial problem that we created because we've got a man-made system where pieces of paper and gold are more value than actual human beings. We won't do the right things. We'll do whatever the constraint that the money offers us. What a stupid system that we have. And so therefore, when it came to COVID-19, when they wanted to get people back to work, they ignored the science. And we all knew this. We all knew that there was a risk because we'd been told before and we've been shown evidence to say that, if you mix, and we all know how colds spread. So the fact is, when everyone said, yeah, just go back, it's all over. And the media stopped counting how many people died, stopped publishing that, the NHS stopped counting it, even though it's still, they're publishing it now. Still people are dying every single day of COVID-19. Those people you tried to save before that we're all clapping for and the NHS saved, they're dying now because we're all mixing. And maybe there wasn't anything other than this herd immunity, which is what they wanted to do at the beginning, is what really did take place by, saying, well, it's not the NHS, because that's all they were really worried about, is the NHS being overwhelmed. Because if the NHS, it would look so bad and they would have to make these difficult decisions of like who lives and who dies, which apparently Matt Hancock would love to do. I talk about him as if I know him. But it's just so crazy, isn't it, the world we live in? That this is how it is. That we could do things that are counter to what's right and what we should do and what would be the best thing to do, just because we have to think about money, or we have to think about those limitations that we created for ourselves, that no God or no person is imposing upon us except ourselves. Anyway, here all this evidence of the futility of the system that we live within. And it's dangerous.
You've just been discussing in the context of Spy B, which is a chilling effect. And if we look at your notes, I will ask you, but at least on the face of it, it seems that this policy of transparency did indeed create this type of chilling effect with SAGE itself during the pandemic. If we can go, please, to the schedule and look at, I think it's 3 references. Thank you. First of all, this one. We're in June 2020, and you write, you refer to a paper from number 10. You say someone has completely rewritten it. They've just cherry-picked, quite extraordinary. And then, for our purposes here, note apparently Simon Case I'm afraid I can't now remember whether at that point he had. No, he wasn't. He was a permanent secretary within the Cabinet Office at that point. He hadn't become the Cabinet Secretary. Simon Case said, "Don't bring new schools advice questions to SAGE as the minutes get published." If we can move on to page 102. Another note, Secretary of State for Education says, "Don't ask SAGE as minutes get published." And then moving forward a few months, both of those references were in June. If we can move forward to page 253, please, we're in October. On a similar theme, apparently the Cabinet Office, so not Department for Education, but the Cabinet Office, now cautious about putting things to SAGE because we publish it all. That's a very bad outcome. Well, it is a bad outcome. Sir Patrick, and I just want to ask for your reflections on where the balance is. I mean, it's for all the reasons you've given, there's a lot to be said for publishing the minutes. But on the other hand, if the consequence of publishing the minutes of an advisory body is that its customers don't come to it for advice anymore, isn't that something of a at least mixed situation?
If I may just, on the very first one you read out about somebody rewriting the science, that was an internal paper in Cabinet Office, and that rewrite never went anywhere. Right. So that I think is not. But this is a very important question, and there is no doubt that DFE took this view at times, and Cabinet Office, there was an alarm that might happen. I don't think in the end it stopped us doing anything on schools that we wanted to do, but it did mean we sometimes didn't get precise questions. I do think it's a problem, and I don't know what the answer to it is, but I believe there is a cultural issue which can be overcome, which is the more the principle is accepted that the evidence is published, not the advice, not the policy position, but the evidence is published, the better government decision making would be. And the more that happens during normal time, as well as during emergencies like this, the more it will become a culturally accepted and reasonable thing. There is a fear sometimes that if the evidence is out there, it's going to force a minister's hand. And as I said, I do think you need to give ministers time to do things before it becomes public. But my approach has been, and I've had this discussion during peacetime in government as well as during the pandemic, is the evidence itself can neither be harmful nor beneficial. It is just what it is. And provided all of the evidence is published, ministerial decision can be completely free to overturn that evidence and say, I choose to do something different. So it is a worry, and it was a concern, particularly during this period. But I don't think the answer is to reach for more redaction or more secrecy around this. I think it's to get into a normalised position where evidence publication is seen as the right route.
So Patrick, you emphasise evidence in contrast to advice. But what we've seen in these extracts is a concern, in this case emanating from the Department for Education, about the SAGE minutes being published. Surely those minutes contain advice?
The minutes usually are containing evidence and have it couched in terms of if the aim is to do X, then the following would be necessary. Or given the state of the pandemic at the moment, without a decrease, it's likely to lead to the following situations. It is usually not the case that it's giving direct advice on precisely what the science is suggesting a minister should do.
So Patrick, we don't want to split hairs about this, but thinking about the practical situation that in this case the Department for Education seemed to have been in, the thought process appears to be, we have this policy that we're considering, why don't we ask SAGE about it? One reason not to ask them about it is that if we do, their minutes will record their discussion, and you can call it evidence if you like, but that anyone reading it will see, if this is the view they took, that they think it's a bad idea. And that will mean that if we go ahead with it, people will criticise us. I mean, that's the problem, isn't it?
It is the problem. And again, I think the more you focus on evidence rather than advice, the easier it is. It is a problem. I don't know what the answer to it is. My instinct is that greater transparency is helpful all round, and my experience from the pandemic was that in the end, none of these came to be a problem. In other words, DFE did try and not bring things to Sage. We overcame that, and they did in the end bring them, and we also did work on it. So they were bumps in the road, they weren't blocks. And I think Stuart Wainwright laid these sort of pros and cons out very nicely in his evidence. I would not wish to see less transparency of the science evidence.
Let me ask you briefly, if I can, about a similar but slightly different issue. Here we're discussing the question of whether Sage were asked at all about issues. There's another issue which emerges from the notes where Sage were asked, but their advice was either ignored or even apparently attempts made to change their advice. Can we look at some entries in your schedule, please? First of all, page 56. So here we have your comment that we've been excluded from the PM's strategy meeting. Chris Whitty, no doubt, is sure that it's because the Economic Secretariat in the Cabinet Office want to be able to present things about reopening without us contradicting them. So perhaps that's, in fact, a little like the other ones we were looking at. Page 94, please. The 2 metre rule meeting made it abundantly clear that no one in number 10 or the Cabinet Office had really read or taken time to understand the science advice. Quite extraordinary. Page 98, please. Number 10 pushing hard on releasing measures. They're pushing very hard, and then this. And want the science altered. We need to hold on to our hats. There will likely be a second peak. And then lastly, page 112. In the economics meeting earlier in the day, they didn't realise CMO was there, and the Chancellor said, it's all about handling the scientists, not handling the virus. They then got flustered when he chipped in. So a collection of entries, all of them, to be clear, in terms of date, around sort of May, June, July, reopening in 2020. The common theme is that either Sage is being ignored, or it's not being asked, or even a suggestion that the Sage scientists should be handled in some way, or that their advice should be altered. Help us. Was there a feeling, perhaps particularly at that time, that perhaps you weren't being asked for your advice in good faith?
I think there were definitely periods when it was clear that the unwelcome advice we were giving was, as expected, not loved. And that meant we had to work doubly hard to make sure that the science, evidence and advice was being properly heard. Now, it doesn't surprise me that there were meetings that we were not included in. That's normal. We were, as I said, in number 10 probably for 45 minutes or an hour, and there were things going on all day and political decisions as well. So it's not surprising that we were not invited to things sometimes. And it definitely is the case that there were times when, because we were giving unpalatable evidence and advice, people would rather not hear it. And I think that probably is a normal part of politics, and our job was to make sure that we weren't in the politics. We were continuing to make that advice as heard as we could make it.
Did you, and this I now ask for your view on reflection, not writing your notes late at night, but did you feel that you were in some way being manipulated or handled, or that your advice was, people were asking you to change your advice?
Well, I don't think anyone, well, I know nobody actually got us to change our advice. I mean, the example of somebody maybe putting pressure on us to do it, we wouldn't do. And I think there's a WhatsApp exchange you've got where Matt Hancock asked me to change something, and I say no. We're not going to change our advice, because that's where the evidence bit comes in, that you've got to at least see that, even if you disagree with it, you don't want to do it. But I'm absolutely sure, because politicians are politicians, that there were attempts to manage us and make sure that we were not always given the access that we might need. But I think overall, we actually managed to get through all of that and make sure that the advice and the evidence was heard. So I don't know what damage it did, and I'm not sure exactly what I'd recommend for the future on that, because it seems to me that's partly the nature of the way the political system seems to operate.
One thing we do know, and you state this in your evidence, is that around this time and in the period just after it, there were a series of government initiatives in respect to which Sage was not asked to provide its advice. Eat Out to Help Out in the summer of 2020, Tears, The Rule of Six, later in the year. I mean, do you know whether the type of thinking that's evidenced in these notes was part of the reason why you weren't asked about those matters?
Quite possibly. I don't know the reasons behind each of those. I mean, Eat Out to Help Out we didn't know about until it was announced, and I think our advice would have been very clear on that. I think the Tears, we were involved in some of the discussions as they started to say what they wanted to do, to try and advise on what would be sensible in different tiers if they were going to go down this route. But I don't think we were involved at the inception of that. And in some ways, nor should we be. These are policy choices, but we should at least see what the policy choice is and have a chance to comment on that. And it's one of the things that I say to chief scientific advisors in every department: you've got to make sure you're at the table for the policy discussion, rather than waiting for somebody to come to you and say, I have a bit of science question that I've got for you.
It's 1 o'clock. You're watching Sky News. We are listening to Sir Patrick Balance, former chief scientific advisor at the COVID inquiry. They're expected to break for lunch very shortly, but let's stay with it until they do.
Time, and indeed Sage, didn't agree with that approach, or at least were alive to the risks that it brought with it. That'd be a better way of putting it.
Well, I think up until that point, the message had been very clear, which is interaction between different households and people that you weren't living with in an enclosed environment with many others was a high-risk activity. That policy completely reversed it to saying, we will pay you to go into an environment with people from other households and mix in an indoor environment for periods extended over a couple of hours or more. And that is a completely opposite public health message as a result of that. Now, it's quite likely that had an effect on transmission. In fact, it's very difficult to see how it wouldn't have had an effect on transmission, and that would have been the advice that was given had we been asked beforehand.
Yes. Well, let me just take you to your statement, if I may. It's paragraph 648, page 209. It's the last sentence or so. You say, as I've discussed, Sage, this is the point you've just made, was not asked to provide advice ahead of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme being introduced. And then you say this, but I think it would have been obvious to all involved that our advice would have been that this was likely to increase transmission of the virus. If we can hold that in mind, can we look at a paragraph of Mr. Sunak's witness statement, please? Thank you. And it's paragraph 317. And Mr. Sunak says, throughout the period at which Eat Out to Help Out was in operation and immediately prior to its implementation, I don't recall any concerns about the scheme being expressed during ministerial discussions, including those attended by the CMO and, no doubt, he means the GCSA. That's you. There's a certain inconsistency between your statement where you say that you think that it would have been apparent to everyone that you opposed it, and Mr. Sunak's statement where he says that you never objected to it.
Well, we didn't see it before it was announced. I think others in the Cabinet Office have also said they didn't see it before it was formulated as a policy, so we weren't involved in the run-up to it. And around that time, lots of measures were being released, and you'll see repeated references in various minutes and notes and emails and indeed, I'm sure in my private notes, to our concern that people were piling on more and more things and that this would come to drive R above 1. And I think that was discussed at Cabinet as well. That was the concern we had. So I think it would have been very obvious to anyone that this was likely to cause inevitably would cause an increase in transmission risk. And I think that would have been known by ministers.
And Mr. Sunak?
If he was in the meetings, I can't recall which meetings he was in, but I'd be very surprised if any minister didn't understand that these openings carried risk.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Patrick. Well, I'm about to move on to another topic.
Certainly, Mr. Bennett. 2 o'clock, please.
All rise. Well, that is the end of the COVID inquiry for this morning. They've just broken for lunch there. The former Chief Scientific Advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, giving evidence to the inquiry. Really interesting exchange at the end there. Some clear blue water, it seems, between what Sir Patrick Vallance is telling the inquiry and what Prime Minister, then Chancellor Rishi Sunak has told the inquiry. They're talking about the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. And Rishi Sunak has told the inquiry in written evidence, of course, he hasn't given physical evidence yet, that there were no concerns about the scheme expressed in Cabinet or from various advisors. But Sir Patrick Vallance there basically saying they weren't asked. He said, we didn't see it before it was announced. We weren't involved in the run-up to it. An increase in transmission would have been known by ministers. And he said he would have been very surprised if Rishi Sunak had not known about this. Also, the inquiry heard Sir Patrick's diaries, in which the former advisor noted on numerous occasions that the Prime Minister at the time, Boris Johnson, was struggling to keep up with the science.
So this is an entry on the 4th of May, and by this stage you are making the notes daily, is that right?
Yes.
You say, late afternoon meeting with the PM on schools. My God, this is complicated. Models will not provide the answer. PM is clearly bamboozled. Page 53, please. PM asking whether we've overdone it on the lethality of this disease. He swings between optimism and pessimism, and then this. PM still confused on different types of test. He holds it in his head for a session, and then it goes. Page 93, please. Watching PM get his head round stats is awful. He finds relative and absolute risk almost impossible to understand. Page 124. PM struggled with whole concept of doubling times, just couldn't get it. And then just 2 more, please. Page 167. This is from later in the year, September. Claire Gardner going through the PM graph, talked PM through the graphs. It's difficult. He asked questions like, which line is the dark red one? Is he colourblind? Then, so you think positivity has gone up overnight? Oh, and oh God, bloody hell. But it's all the same stuff he was shown 6 hours ago. And then finally, 389, this is now going forward to 2021. PM dashboard. Is that a reference to a meeting, dashboard meeting?
Yes.
Taken through the graphs, real struggle to get him to understand them.
And he was in charge of us.
So the question then, Mr. Patrick, is those paragraphs of your statement that we looked at. Yes, you talk about sometimes needing to repeat things and needing to explain things in detail.
Well, let's bring in our health correspondent, Ashish Joshi, who joins me now. And Ashish, quite eye-catching, that exchange about the failings of Boris Johnson in terms of understanding the science. But Sir Patrick Vallance also sort of made it clear that, you know, he said this is not a unique inability. It is not unusual amongst leaders in Western democracies not to understand science.
Yes, he did. I mean, he said right at the beginning of that exchange, Jane, that the Prime Minister was somebody who gave up science when he was 15. So that set the stall out quite clearly early on, ahead of that exchange, that clearly the Prime Minister struggled with the graphs and the interpretation of the data. So Sir Patrick Vallance trying to say I was there, trying to make people understand what was happening, the figures we were seeing, and the way this virus was spreading. But clearly painting a picture of the government's chief scientist being a lone voice among senior politicians, among cabinet ministers and civil servants, and also some tensions between him and the chief medical officer, Sir Chris Whitty. But he said Sir Chris Whitty's position was understandable. As the chief medical officer, he was worried about public health and any early interventions these NPIs, these non-pharmaceutical interventions, would have had, like lockdowns and social distancing and the tiered restrictions that we saw brought in. He was worried about the long-term health complications and the long-term implications of those measures, but he couldn't understand why the politicians simply refused to go earlier, harder and faster with these interventions when they were presented with the data. But it appears that the Prime Minister struggled with the interpretation of these graphs, as did Patrick Vallance, saying many senior Western leaders too.
How do these people get the job then? But this is often the way, isn't it, with those people in charge? the little people know all the information and can do everything, but the little people get to govern. The senior people get to govern. I don't know, just beggars belief he couldn't even understand a graph. And yet he was in control of he was the leader of the United Kingdom. And also the fact that, it's no surprise. What was the reason? Well, I think he probably did understand. He understood, but they just didn't want to follow the evidence. That's the thing. And, obviously, what was the reason why? They were given evidence saying if you don't do this or you do this, then there's going to be lots of deaths. What was the reason for them to ignore it and then to just not do the lockdowns earlier? Like with most people, it was all about what? Money. Of course, it was about money. That's all they were really worried about. Making money, generating money, being able to get money and getting people to go to work to get money. That's why they're changing the welfare benefit system now to say that, if you've got mental health or you're disabled or whatever, you should get back to work. As if that's our only purpose for existence, is work and money and generating it for the tax so that the government can pay back its billions of debt. That if we did, we would be out of our ears.
Hello, welcome back. Boris Johnson wanted to let COVID rip, and his most senior advisor, Dominic Cummings, believed Rishi Sunak thought it was OK to let people die, the COVID inquiry heard today. The former chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick Vallance, painted a picture of a shambolic response to the crisis and said Mr Johnson was bamboozled by the graphs and data presented to him. Apparently he struggled with concepts involved, often having to have them repeatedly explained. Sky's health correspondent Ashish Joshi reports.
Rishi Sunak's hugely controversial Eat Out to Help Out scheme was introduced to save Britain's economy. But the then Chancellor's move, encouraging people to leave their homes during a pandemic and most likely driving the surge in infections, was never put to the country's chief scientific advisor.
The whole truth, nothing but the truth. I think it would have been very obvious to anyone that this was likely to cause inevitably would cause an increase in transmission risk.
Sir Patrick was tasked with leading the country's scientific response to the health crisis.
Next slide, please.
But he was faced with a Prime Minister who struggled with the data and who himself could not follow the science. Sir Patrick kept a diary at the time. In it, he says, 5 hours of meetings with the PM, looked broken, head in hands a lot. He then quotes Boris Johnson as saying, "Is it because of the great British libertarian nation we are that it spread so much? Maybe we are licked as a species. We are to get our act together."
The message that we get from these repeated entries appears to describe something, at least as far as the Prime Minister is concerned, more serious. A repeated failure to understand graphs, scientific concepts and so on.
Well, I think I'm right in saying that the Prime Minister at the time gave up science when he was 15. And I think he'd be the first to admit it wasn't his forte.
Sir Patrick told the inquiry that as it became obvious the virus was spreading faster than previously feared, he found himself increasingly isolated and left out of key decision-making meetings. He wrote, PM meeting begins to argue for letting it, COVID, all rip, saying yes, there will be more casualties, but so be it. They've had a good innings. DC, that's Dominic Cummings, says Rishi thinks just let people die and that's okay. This all feels like a complete lack of leadership. He goes on to say, the right-wing press are culpable and we have a weak, indecisive PM. The start of the pandemic was clearly a very difficult time for Sir Patrick Vallance, faced with government leaders who were pushing back against imposing restrictions too quickly. But even later on, ahead of the next lockdown, Sir Patrick Vallance was faced with a Prime Minister who wanted to let the virus run through the general population. Sir Patrick's testimony chimes with earlier evidence presented to the inquiry that describes the chaos and ineffective leadership at the heart of government. But perhaps as the government's chief scientific advisor during a pandemic, it is all the more damning. Ashish Joshi at the COVID inquiry.
Let's pick up, shall we, with Guto and Ben. Guto, to you first. You obviously worked closely with Boris Johnson. Bamboozled by data.
I just don't recognise that at all. And I've run it past a number of people. He can get his head around just about everything. Whatever else you think of him, whatever you think of his policies, his decisions, the idea that this is not a highly intelligent, educated man who can get his head around a lot of things is ridiculous.
So why would Patrick Vallance be making it up then?
Well, I hesitate to say the arrogance of the unelected. I hesitate to say somebody who is looking at one tiny piece of the jigsaw, a big jigsaw, and a very important piece of the jigsaw.
He was in those meetings with him, wasn't he?
But he was there as somebody who understood modelling of what a virus in an unprecedented situation might do in the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister has got to, A, answer to the electorate, B, pick up the pieces today where we spend 400 billion locking down with all the consequences that we've touched upon tonight. There are much bigger considerations that he had to think about, and he had to weigh up lives as well as livelihoods, as well as legacy, as well as everything else. So to turn up as the expert witness and then just sort of slag off everybody else because they don't just agree with your narrow piece of the jigsaw is the...
I suppose it depends whether your main purpose is the livelihood of the people you govern. I mean, look at how this person is defending. Yeah, I get it, how he's trying to say, but they always do that. Whenever there's someone who comes up with something that you don't like, it's always, oh, this person only knows the smallest part, and they're unelected. But this guy was the chief scientific advisor. Everyone was told, we need to listen to science, we need to be followed by science. And then it's like, well, I don't like your science, and you're wrong, your view's wrong. And this man is very intelligent. Well, the case is that what I was really worried about was money. And to try and defend that now, and I don't know, obviously Sir Patrick Vallance was thinking about, the people, and, if you didn't do lockdowns quick enough, then you would have more people dying. But this guy's trying to defend him when he's already written down that Boris Johnson said, let it rip. They've had a good innings. Is there any defence of that?
So the jigsaw, I'm sorry to sort of, I'm sure he's a brilliant scientist, worked with him last year, but he's not looking at the big picture. And the idea that Boris is not capable of understanding science is ludicrous.
Ben,
I don't think it's necessarily so much he wasn't capable of understanding it, although Eton was never a strong point in the sciences, was it, in his day? It's just that he didn't take any notice of it. I mean, Patrick Vallance was the chief scientific advisor, and I think what you heard today was his frustration, that time after time after time, the advice that he's paid to give government independently on stuff he knows was ignored, or completely the opposite was done. I don't think we learned anything particularly new in that line about Boris Johnson, apart from the power of the right-wing press to influence his otherwise irrational decision. Worrying, I thought, was the evidence about Rishi Sunak's Eat Out to Help Out scheme, which wasn't even put before Sage. The scientific advisors weren't even given their asked for their advice on that. As we know, that had catastrophic results in terms of extra deaths. It didn't help the economy because we went back into a much worse lockdown sooner than we otherwise would have done.
Can I get a quick thought from you both?
Here's Chris Whitty now talking about some, well, they're quite interesting to do the same thing really, science being ignored in a pandemic where we were all told to our faces that we're all following the science. And we all could see that this wasn't the case because the policies that were coming out didn't seem to be. But that's how you can get away with it in government. You can have scientific advisors and they can present their information even though they're the qualified ones and have to give evidence. They can't just have supposition, it has to be evidence-based generally. They can come up and give you that and then you can just ignore it if you so choose because you feel that, wow, that's not, that's going to cost us a lot of money, so I'd rather people die instead. Let's just remember what Boris Johnson said, let it rip. And they've had a good innings. That's going to be the title of this one, I think. Unacceptable.
Refuse our request to move. The other situation, and I just want to be really clear on this one, is it is also legitimate in my view, and I did this from time to time, for me to give advice direct to the public, which they can choose to take or not. And in, for example, the winter of 2021, I did, for example, advise, which was not government policy, that people were extremely careful in their period around Christmas. That wasn't, in my view, political advice. That was public health advice. They could take it or not. It wasn't the government speaking. A very large number of people did take that advice. But that is a legitimate thing for a public health person to do. My Director of Public Health colleagues around the country would give similar kinds of advice in their regional areas, the CMOs in the other 4 nations. So that is intrinsic to the job of a CMO or a public health advisor. But that is very different from things that involve government or the force of law or the use of taxes.
And in order to shoot as many hares as possible, does it also follow that ministers were absolutely clear that as the democratically elected representatives, it was exclusively for them to make the decisions and not for you or SAGE or any other part of the government machine that wasn't an elected representative?
I think that a few of them in the early stages needed some help to see that was there. There was no option but for them to make the decision. But that wasn't because they were trying to shirk their responsibilities. I think they saw it as a technocratic exercise, and I saw it as a political exercise at the end of the day, that the technocratic bit was giving the technical advice. The political situation follows on from that. But I think once people had internalised that, and there was no pushback on it, then I think ministers were clear that they ultimately held the responsibility to balance the various issues.
In truth, were there ever any good or easy outcomes?
So there were 2 things I said right from the beginning, and I, still don't think there's any reason to doubt them. The first of which is there were no good options. All the options were very bad. Some were a bit worse, and some were very, very bad. And the second is this was going to go on for a long time. So if you took an option, you had to be prepared to see it through for many months to years, rather than just seeing this as a temporary situation. And I think, again, this took a while for some people to internalise that this was not going to be in any way easy, and it also was going to be long, and it was also going to involve significant loss of life, almost irrespective, unfortunately, of whatever decision was taken, but where some decisions would lead to substantially worse outcomes from a public health point of view.
And is it because ultimately these momentous decisions could only be for ministers that the mantra that they were following science was, in your opinion, inaccurate?
Yeah, I mean, both Sir Patrick and I, when it initially happened, remembering that our job was to get science into government, thought, oh, this is a good thing. Government is recognising that science is important. Very soon we realised it was a millstone around our necks and didn't help government either, because it blurred the distinction between the very firm, clear demarcation that must and did exist between technical advice and...
Just a little bit of further information we can bring you about the future of Top Gear that the BBC has announced. In its words, will be rested for the foreseeable future. Others may well read that as being scrapped. They've given a statement and they say that given the exceptional circumstances, the BBC has decided...
Oh my God. People dying. We're having a COVID inquiry. We'll
have more to say in the future on this. We know resting the show will be disappointing.
I want to hear Chris Whitty, not bloody Top Gear.
There hasn't been any Top Gears filmed since.
I'm going to forward it so you don't have to hear it.
Taking the advice you're giving.
Could have been the other way, but yes, no doubt about it at all. But that was inevitable and, in my view, didn't apply, and I really want to be clear about this, to, in my view, the principal decision makers in government. So the Prime Minister, the then Secretary of State for Health, the then Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster, for example, nor did, in my view, it apply to the great majority of political leaders. But there definitely were some who chose the science they wanted to hear, let's put it that way. And undoubtedly, there were political commentators whose view of science started with what is my political position and then derived from there. But in terms of the decision makers in the decisions that were taken during COVID in the UK, my view is I don't think they were not intending to cherry pick. They may have done so by accident, but it wasn't by design.
You obviously spent a great deal of time in Number 10. You worked very closely with government ministers and government advisors for an inordinate amount of time. A certain degree of administrative confusion can be expected in any government dealing with a crisis of this magnitude. But how efficiently did you assess the administrative system around the Prime Minister to be operated?
I thought that the civil servants, including particularly the health and economics private sectors, did a very, very good job in difficult circumstances. If I'm honest, I think that the political system around the Prime Minister was more mixed. But I don't think that was really as much to the fore in this set of decisions as it was in some other areas. It was quite often chaotic, but actually I'd be very doubtful if it wasn't chaotic in multiple other governments. And in fact, that was what our fellow advisors from other countries said in many other environments, that this was difficult for every country. It was being faced by extraordinary circumstances. And I think if I can take a step back, I think it's very dangerous for people in my kind of job to say, who would I have as my fantasy Prime Minister at this point in time? The choices put for the electorate, if the opposition had won the election, it would have been Mr. Corbyn. If Mr. Johnson had not been able to continue, it would have been Liz Truss. They would have had different sets of challenges and advantages as leaders. It's the job of the technical people to work with whoever is there. That is their job. And I think it is important not to personalise, in a sense, the situation between technical advisors and ministers. I think it's important to work with whoever is there.
Professor, so that there can be no doubt, the inquiry has not asked you, and we're not seeking to ask you to express your views on the political attributes or ability of any individual. My question was directed solely at the issue of decision-making and the processes by which these momentous decisions were taken. There is clear evidence, although ultimately, of course, it is absolutely a matter for Milady to determine, that there was a difficulty the Prime Minister had a difficulty in reaching clear, consistent positions. Ample evidence relating to oscillation or backing and veering, whatever have you. Did you observe that? Because, of course, you were there.
I think that the way that Mr. Johnson took decisions was unique to him.
Well, now, if I may interrupt, that's a euphemism, if ever I've heard it. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, he has a quite distinct style, but I think lots of other people have got quite distinct styles, and I do want to, in a sense, take your invitation not to make commentaries on individual politicians. I don't actually think that's my role particularly.
No.
You know what? There's a difference between him and Patrick Vallance is because Patrick Vallance is retired now, isn't it? He's still working for them, so he can't say the things that he really wants to say, and that's why he's taking the fifth now.
But you gave advice within the confines of Sage and your role, of course, on the public health issues. And you expected the government to be able to respond efficiently, speedily. You've referred to the need for speed earlier. It must have been apparent to you that the government encountered significant difficulties in being able to reach collectively, through the Prime Minister or otherwise, decisions that they then stuck to and they consistently abided by. This degree of oscillation and chaos is apparent.
That's correct, but I think it's a matter of record that many other nations had similar problems expressed in different ways in this major international crisis.
Finally, on the subject of decision making, you've already confirmed that there were verbal briefings in number 10 that were unrecorded, but in the nature of these things, principal private secretaries and advisors would keep notes. There'd be readouts of all the meetings. Do you assess that that all the meetings that you had, all the engagements, the verbal briefings were adequately recorded? That there were thousands of hours of meetings between yourself, Sir Patrick, and government, and they're not all recorded. Do you think, in hindsight, that the lack of formality, the lack of transparency, may have contributed to that degree of chaos, or perhaps to the oscillation which witnesses have described the Prime Minister suffered from?
I think that. Well, firstly, I didn't get to see ministerial minutes for many of the meetings I went to, and in fact, one of the interesting things in this process has been reading minutes where my memory of the events is not exactly in accordance with the minutes. I'm quite sure they were done in good faith. I'm just making that as a comment.
That's always the way with these minutes. When someone speaks and says all the things, they always put, you say like 2 paragraphs and it becomes 2 lines. And takes it out of context the things you said. We all know that.
In this process has been reading minutes where my memory of the events is not exactly in accordance with the minutes. I'm quite sure they were done in good faith. I'm just making that as a comment. Inevitably, a lot of the way by which senior ministers, including the Prime Minister, came to their position was done informally in conversation. And for example, one of the times where we had the most conversation with the Prime Minister in a small group, where he tended to be at his most focused, was in the briefing just before we did press conferences. That was not a formal meeting, that was really just working things out, but actually it allowed him to test out ideas, not in public, which I think he valued and I think helped the decision-making process. But it wasn't a formal meeting and it wasn't minuted. But I think that the decision-making meetings were from fairly early on. My sense was the record-keeping in the very first bit of the pandemic was less strong. But I wasn't the person who the minutes were aimed at, and I didn't see a lot of them, but that was my sense at the time. For legitimate reasons of people being stretched all over the place, but the fact of it is, I think, relatively clear.
Well, let's return to the COVID-19 inquiry that we've been bringing you this morning. So Chris Whitty has been explaining the difficulties of calling the initial lockdown.
Actually had 2 different things we were trying to balance. The risk of going too early, in which case you get all the damages from this with actually fairly minimal impact on the epidemic, and the risk of going too late, in which case you get all the problems of the pandemic running away. Now, as we will, I'm sure, come on to, my view is, with the benefit of hindsight, we went a bit too late on the first wave, and I've been very clear about that for some time.
Our health correspondent Ashish Joshi joins us live now from central London. And Ashish, Hugo Keith, KC lead counsel to the inquiry, been pushing Chris Whitty quite strongly this morning, but Chris Whitty sort of quite a strong defender of decisions that were made.
Yes, that's been the theme this morning, Jane. Hugo Keith clearly trying to explore this line that was presented yesterday by Sir Patrick Vallance, the chief scientific advisor at the time, who suggested that he was in the camp that wanted to go hard and go fast very early on in the pandemic, and there was quite some pushback from ministers and senior government advisors, and also from the chief medical officer, Chris Whitty, at the time, who was concerned about the wider impacts on the population about health outcomes which would be felt if lockdown was imposed too soon. Very early on in the session, Chris Whitty dispelled any notion that there was a rift between him and Sir Patrick Vallance. He said this was absolutely normal, it was natural. There was Sir Patrick Vallance talking about the scientific impact and why interventions, non-pharmaceutical interventions, would be required, and why, in his role as Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty had to argue about the wider health implications, the impact on our mental health, the impact of isolation, and especially the widening of health inequalities. And as you said, right throughout this morning's session, he has been defending his line. He said when he was presented with the evidence, even by Professor Jonathan Van Tam, who had been alerted to this rise in cases and the worrying cases in China, even in January, Professor Chris Whitty said it was too soon given the evidence he had at the time. And in retrospect and in hindsight, he has been on the record as saying he does think the UK acted too slowly by the time of the first lockdown, but certainly in January, he said if he were presented with the same evidence again, he would stay in the same position, i.e. he made the right call at the time, given the evidence that was presented. And we don't get much of the detail about any tensions that might have existed like we did yesterday. So Chris Whitty plays it very straight. He sticks to the medical facts. He doesn't opine. He doesn't talk about personalities. But there was one moment when you began to understand how he felt as the chief medical officer when he was talking about science and the facts and how the government, and he said not the Prime Minister or senior ministers, but members of the government would cherry pick the science to suit their own political agendas. And this is what he said about the slogan and being presented as a public face of the government's science.
Both Sir Patrick and I, when it initially happened, remembering that our job was to get science into government, thought, oh, this is a good thing. Government is recognising that science is important. Very soon we realised it was a millstone around our necks and didn't help government either, because it blurred the distinction between the very firm, clear demarcation that must and did exist between technical advice and political decision, for which people are then answerable in the ballot box and in Parliament.
He didn't elaborate on who those politicians might have been who chose to cherry pick the science, but he did say it wasn't Boris Johnson, it wasn't any of the senior cabinet ministers, but certainly an indication that there was some tension between the scientists and the politicians.
Okay, Ashish, thank you very much.
So there you go, there was Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Chris Whitty giving their evidence in the COVID-19 inquiry. Yeah, I thought it was quite interesting to see how, when they were standing there in front of us on the podium with prime ministers and the health sector and etc., none of this was brought to our attention. We all believed everything that was being said and that science was being followed and the right decisions were being made, even though, you know, a lot of people had questions about, you know, some of the policies like the, you know, ending lockdowns and everyone going back when people were still dying at rates just because they wanted businesses to carry on making money and then get taxed. I mean, yeah, I guess 400, is it billion? Or is it million? I don't know how much is what it cost. Well, it's so expensive to run a country, isn't it? And to do all these welfare things. Wouldn't it be better? I mean, because this is a man-made construct, money. Wouldn't it be better if we didn't have money? Because then we could do all this stuff without having the stress and worry of all these things. What, you know? Because to help each other out, We've got resources, we've got energy. Like the actual, what was done, giving people money so they could pay bills and stay at home. Well, if you didn't have that money, you wouldn't have to do. If you didn't have money, you wouldn't have to do any of that stuff. And if people could manufacture things a lot cheaper because they don't have to have competition, everyone's working together. What better world would it be without money? We put this on ourselves, and now we've got a cost of living crisis because of that debt, and we're now up to 100% of our GDP, and all these other debts, and they're trying to cut welfare, get people who are disabled and mental health back to work, and all that kind of stuff, or work from home, and not do the things that are actually beneficial for humanity because of their constraints of money, an unnecessary constraint that we put ourselves upon. But I suppose with Chris Whitty and whatever, the main thing that came out of it was the ineptitude, as we often see, of governments, and maybe not just ours but around the world. And these are the people that we have a choice of two old men, and we pick one of them, and we believe that that's democracy, and that's freedom of choice, and that's the way we should live. And they get to impose all their decisions based on whatever they think, or whatever level of education or wisdom they have. I don't know, isn't it crazy, huh? You couldn't make this up. And this is, and people would, if you say, we'll get rid of money and we'll all live together and, forget about land division and all that, and we'll just say about human beings, people think, well, that's crazy, isn't it? But you don't think that working for money, that's a man-made construct, is arbitrary, it's not necessary, and putting a constraint on us so that actual people die and suffer is a better way of living, or a more feasible way of how we got here. Anyway, take care, take it easy, God bless, and peace.